Hello, back after a long old break of no stories from me, Mr. Key, but I am back to carry on our reading of The Wind in the Willows. So, a quick recap. We met right at the beginning our friend the mole, who blustered off out of his house, sick of all the tidying up and the spring cleaning, to go on a wander. On his wander, he found a river, and on the river, he found Ratty. And Ratty quickly took him under his wing and showed him all the delights of above ground living. They met Mr. Toad and went off on an adventure in his caravan pulled by a horse. And they met Mr. Badger when the mole took himself off on an adventure into the woods and got lost in the snow. They spent some time with Badger in his house and eventually took to wander home with a little help from the otter. We rejoin the story with our two friends wandering after a day out with Otter. Let's see what they get up to. The sheep ran huddling together against the hurdles, blowing out thin nostrils and stampeding with delicate forefeet, their heads thrown back and a light steam rising from the crowded sheep pen into the frosty air as the two animals hastened by in high spirits. Much chatter and laughter. They were returning across the country after a long day's outing with Otter, hunting and exploring in the wide uplands, where certain streams tributary to their own river had their first small beginnings, and the shades of a short winter day were closing in on them. They had still some distance to go, plodding at random across the plough. They'd heard the sheep and had made for them, and now, leading from the sheep pen, they found a beaten track that made walking a lighter business, and responded, moreover, to a small inquiring, something which all animals carry inside them, saying unmistakably, "Yes, quite right. This leads home." "Looks as if we're coming to a village," said Mole, somewhat dubiously, slackening his pace as the track, that had in time become a path and then had developed into a lane, now handed them over to the charge of a well-metalled road. The animals did not hold with villages, and their own highways, thickly frequented as they were, took an independent course regardless of church, post office or public house. "Oh, never mind," said Rat. "At this season of year they'll all be safe indoors, sitting around the fire, men, women and children, dogs and cats and all. We'll slip through all right, without any bother or unpleasantness, and we can have a look at them through the windows if you like, and see what they are doing." The rapid nightfall of mid-December had quite beset the little village as they approached it on soft feet over the first thin fall of powdery snow. Little was visible but squares of dusty orange-red on either side of the street, where the firelight or lamplight of each cottage overflowed through the casements into the dark world without. Most of the low lattice windows were innocent of blinds, and to the lookers in from outside, the inmates gathered around the tea table, absorbed in handiwork or talking with laughter and gesture, had each that happy grace which is the last thing the skilled actor shall capture, the natural grace which goes with perfect unconsciousness of observation. Moving at will from one theatre to another, the two spectators, so far from home themselves, had something of a wistfulness in their eyes as they watched a cat being stroked, a sleepy child picked up and huddled off to bed, or a tired man stretch and knock out his pipe on the end of a smouldering log. But it was from one little window, with its blind drawn down, a mere blank transparency in the night, that the sense of home and the little curtained world within the walls, the larger stressful world of outside nature shut out and forgotten, most pulsated. Close against the white blind hung a birdcage, clearly silhouetted, every wire, perch and appurtenance distinct and recognisable, even to yesterday's dull-edged lump of sugar. In the middle of the perch sat a fluffy occupant, head tucked well into its feathers, seeming so near as if to easily be stroked had they tried. Even the delicate tips of his plumage penciled plainly on the illuminated screen. As they looked, the sleepy little fellow stirred uneasily, woke, shook himself and raised his head. They could see the gape of his tiny beak as he yawned in a bored sort of way, looked around, and then settled his head into his back again, while the ruffled feathers gradually subsided into perfect stillness. Then a gust of bitter wind took them in the back of the neck. A small sting of frozen sleet on the skin woke them as if from a dream, and they knew their toes to be cold and their legs tired. Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased abruptly, on either side of the road they could smell the darkness of friendly fields again, and they braced themselves for the last long stretch, the home stretch. The stretch that we know is bound to end sometime in the rattle of the door latch, the sudden firelight, the sight of familiar things greeting us as long absent travellers from far over sea. They plodded along steadily and silently, each of them thinking his own thoughts. The mole ran a good deal on supper, as it was pitch dark, and it was a strange country for him as far as he knew, and he was following quite obediently in the wake of Rat, leading the guidance entirely up to him. As for the Rat, he was walking a little way ahead, as his habit was, his shoulders humped, his eyes fixed on the straight grey road in front of him. So he did not notice poor Mole when suddenly the summons reached him and took him like an electric shock. We others, who have long lost the more subtle of the physical senses, have not even proper terms to express an animal's intercommunications with its surroundings, living or otherwise, and only have the word smell, for instance, to include a whole range of delicate thrills which murmur in the nose of animals day and night. Summoning, warning, inciting, repelling, was one of these mysterious fairy calls from out of the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with a very familiar appeal, even while he could not yet clearly remember what it was. He stopped dead in his tracks, his nose searching hither and thither in its efforts to recapture that fine filament, that telegraphic current that had so strongly moved him. A moment, and he was caught again, and this time with it came recollection in fullest flood. Home! That's what it meant. Those caressing appeals, those soft touches that wafted through the air, those invisible little hands pulling and tugging, all one way. Why, it must be quite close by him at this moment. His old home that he'd hurriedly forsaken and never sought again, that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and its messengers to capture him and bring him in. Since his escape on that bright morning he had hardly given it a thought, so absorbed had he been in his new life, in all its pleasures and surprises, its fresh and captivating experiences. Now, with a rush of old memories, how clearly it stood up before him in the darkness. Shabby indeed, and small and poorly finished, and yet the home that he had made for himself. The home he had been so happy to get back to after a day's work, and the home that had been happy with him too, evidently, and was missing him, and wanted him back, and was willing to tell him so, through his nose, sorrowfully, reproachfully, but with no bitterness or anger. Only the plaintive reminder that it was there, and that it wanted him. The call was clear, the summons plain. He must obey it instantly, and go. "Ratty," he called, full of joyful excitement. "Hold on, come back. I want you to, quick." "Oh, come along, Mole, do," replied the Rat cheerfully, still plodding along. "Please, stop, Ratty," pleaded the poor Mole in anguish of heart. "You don't understand. It's my home, my old home. I've just come across the smell of it, and it's close by here, really quite close. And I must go to it. I must. Oh, come back, Ratty. Please come back." The Rat, by this time, was very far ahead, too far to hear clearly what the Mole was calling, too far to catch the sharp note of painful appeal in his voice. And he was much taken up by the weather, for he too could smell something suspiciously like approaching snow. "Mole, we mustn't stop now, really," he called back. "We'll come for it tomorrow, whatever it is you found. But I daren't stop now, it's late, and snow's coming on again. I'm not sure of the way, and I want your nose. So come on quick, there's a good fellow." And the Rat pressed forward on his way without waiting for an answer. Poor Mole stood alone in the dark, his heart torn asunder, and a big sob gathering somewhere low down inside him, to leap up to the surface presently. he knew in passionate escape. But even under such a test as this, his loyalty to his friends stood firm. Never for a moment did he dream of abandoning him. Meanwhile, the wafts from his old home pleaded, whispered and conjured, and finally claimed him imperiously. He dared not tarry longer within their magical circle. With a wrench that tore his very heartstrings, he set his face down to the road and followed submissively in the tracks of the rat, while the faint, thin smell, still dogging his retreating nose, reproached him for his new friendship and his callous forgetfulness. With an effort, he caught up to the unsuspecting rat, who began chattering cheerfully about what they would do when they got back, and how jolly of a fire the logs in the parlour would make, and what a supper he meant to eat, never noticing his companion's silence or distressful state of mind. At last, however, when they had gone some considerable way further, and were passing some tree stumps at the edge of a copse that bordered the road, he stopped and said kindly, "Look here, Mole, my old chap, you seem dead tired. No talk left in you, and your feet dragging like lead. Well, sit down here and rest for a minute. The snow has held off so far, and the best part of the journey's over." The mole subsided forlornly onto a tree stump and tried to control himself, for he felt it surely coming. The sob he had fought so long now refused to be beaten. Up and up it forced its way to the air, and then another, and others thick and fast, till poor Mole at last gave up the struggle and cried freely and helplessly and openly, now that he knew it was all over, and that he had lost what he could hardly be said to have found. The rat, astonished and dismayed at the violence of Mole's paroxysm of grief, did not dare to speak for a while, and at last he said very quietly and sympathetically, "What is it, old fellow? Whatever can be the matter? Tell us your trouble, and let me see what I can do." Poor Mole found it difficult to get out any words between the upheavals of his chest that followed one upon another so quickly, and held back speech and choked it as it came. "I know it's a shabby and dingy little place," he sobbed forth at last brokenly. "Not like your cosy quarters, or Toad's beautiful hall, or Badger's great house, but it was my own little home, and I was fond of it, and I went away and I forgot all about it, and then I smelt it suddenly on the road, and when I called back and you wouldn't listen, Rat, and everything came back to me with a rush, and I wanted it, oh dear, and when you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, and then I had to leave it, though I was smelling it all the time. I thought my heart would break. We might have just gone and had one look at it, Ratty. Only one look, it was close by, but you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, you wouldn't turn back. Oh dear. Recollection brought fresh waves of sorrow, and sobs again took full charge of him, preventing any further speech. The rat stared in front of him, saying nothing, only patting Mole gently on the shoulder. After a time he muttered gloomily, "I see it all now. What a pig I have been! A pig! That's me! Just a pig, a plain pig!" He waited till Mole's sobs gradually became less stormy and more rhythmical. He waited till the last sniffs were frequent and the sobs only intermittent. Then he rose from his seat and remarked carelessly, "Well, we'd really better be going, old chap," and set off up the road over the toilsome way they'd just come. "Wherever are you going to, Ratty?" cried the tearful Mole, looking up in alarm. "We're going to find that old home of yours, my fellow," replied the rat pleasantly. "So you'd better come along, for it'll take some finding, and we shall want your nose." "Oh, come back, Ratty, do," cried the Mole, getting up and hurrying after him. "It's no good, I tell you. It's too late and too dark, and the place is too far off, and the snow's coming, and I never meant to let you know I was feeling that way about it. It was all accident and mistake. And think of Riverbank and your supper." "Hang Riverbank and supper too," the rat said heartily. "I tell you, I'm going to find this place now if I stay out all night." So, cheer up, old chap, and take my arm, and we'll soon be very well back there again. Still snuffling, pleading, and reluctant, Mole suffered himself to be dragged back along the road by his imperious companion, who, by a flow of cheerful talk and anecdote, endeavoured to beguile his spirits back and make the weary way seem shorter. When at last it seemed to Rat that they must be nearing the part of the road where Mole had been held up, he said, "Now, no more talking. Business. Use your nose and give your mind to it." They moved in silence for some little way when suddenly the Rat was conscious, through his arm that linked in Mole's, of a faint sort of electric thrill that passed down the animal's body. Instantly he disengaged himself, fell back a pace, and waited, all attention. The signals were coming through. Mole stood for a moment rigid, while his uplifted nose, quivering slightly, felt the air. Then a short, quick run forward, a fault, a check, a try back, and then a slow, steady, confident advance. The Rat, much excited, kept close to his heels as the Mole, with something of the air of a sleepwalker, crossed a dry ditch, scrambled through a hedge, and nosed his way over a field of open, trackless, bare, faint in the starlight. Suddenly, without giving warning, he dived, but the Rat was on alert and promptly followed him down the tunnel to which his unerring nose had faithfully led them. It was close and airless, and the earthy smell was strong, and it seemed a long time to Rat ere the passage ended, and he could stand erect and stretch and shake himself. The Mole struck a match, and by its light the Rat saw that they were standing in an open space, neatly swept and sanded underfoot, and directly facing them was Mole's little front door, with Mole End painted on it in Gothic lettering over a bell pull at the side. Mole reached down a lantern from a nail on the wall and lit it, and the Rat, looking around him, saw he was in a sort of forecourt. A garden seat stood on one side of the door, and on the other a roller, for the Mole, who was a tidy animal when at home, could not stand having his ground kicked up by other animals into the little runs that ended in earth heaps. On the wall hung wire baskets with ferns in them, alternating with brackets carrying plaster statuary, Garibaldi, the infant Samuel, and Queen Victoria, and other heroes of modern Italy. Down on one side of the forecourt ran a skittle alley with benches along it and little wooden tables marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. In the middle was a small round pond containing goldfish and surrounded by a little cockleshell border. Out of the centre of the pond rose a fanciful erection clothed in more cockleshells and topped by a large silver glass ball that reflected everything all wrong and had a very pleasing effect. Mole's face beamed at the sight of these objects so dear to him, and he hurried Rat through the door, lit a lamp in the hall, and took one glance around his old home. He saw the dust laying thick on everything, and saw the cheerless, deserted look of a long-neglected house, and its narrow, meagre dimensions, its worn and shabby contents, and collapsed again onto the hall chair, his nose in his paws. "Oh, Ratty," he cried dismally, "why ever did I do it? Why did I bring you to this poor, cold little place on a night like this? And you might have been at the river bank by this time, toasting your toes before a blazing fire with all your own nice things about you." The Rat paid no heed to his doleful self-reproaches. He was running here and there, opening doors, inspecting rooms and cupboards, lighting lamps and candles, and sticking them up everywhere. "What a capital little house this is," he called out cheery. "So compact, so well planned, everything here and everything in its place. We'll make a jolly night of it. The first thing we'll want is a good fire. I'll see to that. I always know where to find things. So, this is your parlour. Splendid. Your own idea of those little sleeping bunks in the wall. Capital. Now, I'll fetch the wood and the coals, and you get the duster. Mole, you'll find one in the drawer of just by the kitchen table, and you try smarting things up a bit. Bustle about, old chap." Encouraged by his inspiring companion, the Mole roused himself and dusted and polished with energy and heartiness, while the Rat, running to and fro with armfuls of fuel, soon had a cheerful blaze roaring up the chimney. He hailed to the mole to come and warm himself, but the mole promptly had another fit of the blues, dropping down on the couch in dark despair and burying his face in the duster. "Rat," he moaned, "how about your supper, you poor cold, hungry, weary animal? I've nothing to give you, not a crumb." "What a fellow you are for giving in," said the rat reproachfully. "Why, only just now I saw a sardine opener on the kitchen dresser quite distinctly, and everyone knows that means there are sardines somewhere in this neighbourhood. Rouse yourself, pull yourself together, and come with me, we'll forage." They went and foraged accordingly, hunting through every cupboard and turning out every drawer. The result was not so very depressing after all, though, of course, it might have been a bit better. A tin of sardines, a box of Captain's biscuits, nearly full, and a German sausage encased in silver paper. "There's the banquet for you," observed the rat as he arranged the table. "I know some animals who'd be given their ears to sit down to supper with us tonight." "No bread," groaned the mole dolorously. "No butter, no pâté de foie gras, no champagne," continued the rat, grinning. "And that reminds me, what's that little door at the end of the passage?" "Your cellar, of course. Every luxury in this house. Just you wait a minute." He made for the cellar door and presently reappeared, somewhat dusty, with a bottle of beer in each paw and another under each arm. "Self-indulgent beggar you seem to be, Mole. Deny yourself nothing," he observed. "This really is the jolliest little place I was ever in. Now, wherever did you pick up those prints? Make the place seem so home-like they do. No wonder you're so fond of it, Mole. Tell us all about it, and how you came to make it what it is." Then, while the rat busied himself fetching plates and knives and forks and mustard which he mixed in an egg cup, the mole, his bosom heaving with the stress of his recent emotion, related, somewhat shyly at first, but with more freedom as he warmed to the subject, how this was planned and how that was thought out, and how this was got through with a windfall from his aunt, and that was a wonderful find and a bargain. And the other thing was brought out of laborious savings and a certain amount of going without. His spirits finally quite restored, he must needs go and caress his possessions and take a lamp and show off their points to his visitors and expatiate on them, and quite forgetful of the supper they both so much needed. Rat, who was clearly desperately hungry but strove to conceal it, was nodding seriously, examining with a puckered brow, and saying, "Wonderful," and "most remarkable," at intervals when the chance for an observation was given him. At last Rat succeeded in decoying him to the table and just got seriously to work with the sardine opener, when sounds were heard from the forecourt, sounds of scuffling small feet in the gravel and confusing murmur of tiny voices, while broken sentences reached them all. "Now all, do line up. Hold the lantern up a bit, Tommy. Clear your throats first. No coughing after I say 1, 2, 3. Where's young Bill? Here, come on, do. We're all waiting." "What's up?" inquired the rat, pausing in his labours. "I think it must be the field mice," replied the mole with a touch of pride in his manner. "They go round carol singing regularly at this time of year. They're quite an institution in these parts, and they never do pass me over. They come to Mole End last of all. I used to give them hot drinks and supper too sometimes when I can afford it. It will be like old times to hear them again." "Let's have a look at them," cried the rat, jumping and running to the door. It was a pretty sight, and a seasonable one, that met their eyes when they flung the door open in the forecourt, lit by the dim rays of a horn lantern. Some 8 or 10 little field mice stood in a semicircle, red worsted comforters around their throats, their forepaws thrusted deep into their pockets, their feet jigging for warmth. With bright, beady eyes they glanced shyly at each other, sniggering a little, sniffing and applying coat sleeves a good deal. As the door opened, one of the elder ones that carried the lantern was just saying, "Now then, 1, 2, 3, and forthwith their shrill little voices rose up on the air, singing one of the old-time carols that their forefathers composed in the fields that were fallow and held by frost, or when snowbound in chimney corners, and handed down to be sung in the miry street to lamplit windows at Yuletime. Eventually the voices ceased. The singers, bashful but smiling, exchanged sidelong glances, and silence succeeded, but for a moment. Then, from up above and far away down the tunnel they had so lately travelled, was borne to the ears a faint musical hum of the sound of distant bells ringing a joyful and clangorous peal. "Very well sung, boys," cried the rat heartily. "And now come along in, all of you, and warm yourselves by the fire and have something hot." "Yes, come along, field mice," cried the mole eagerly. "This is quite like old times. Shut the door after you and pull up that settle to the fire. Now, you just wait a minute while we—" "Oh, Ratty," he cried in despair, plumping down with tears impending. "Whatever are we doing? We've nothing to give them." "You leave that all to me," said the masterful rat. "Here, you, with the lantern. Come over this way. I want to talk to you. Now, tell me, are there any shops open at this hour of the night?" "Why, certainly, sir," replied the field mouse respectfully. "At this time of year our shops keep open to all sorts of hours." "Then look here," said the rat. "You go off at once, you and your lantern, and you get me—" Here much muttered conversation involved, and the mole only heard bits of it, such as "Fresh, mind? No, a pound of that will do. See you get Buggins, for I won't have any other. No, only the best. If you can't get it there, then try somewhere else. Oh yes, of course, homemade, no tin stuff. Well then, do the best you can." Finally there was a chink of coin passing from paw to paw. The field mouse was provided with an ample basket for his purchases, and off he hurried with his lantern. The rest of the field mice, perched in a row on the settle, their small legs swinging, gave themselves up to the enjoyment of the fire and toasted their chilblains till they tingled, while the mole, failing to draw them into easy conversation, plunged into family history and made each of them recite the names of his numerous brothers, who were too young, it appeared, to be allowed to go out to carolling this year, but looked forward very shortly to winning the parental consent. The rat, meanwhile, was busy examining the label of one of the beer bottles. "I perceive this to be old Burton," he remarked approvingly. "Sensible mole. The very thing. Now we'll be able to mull some ale. Get things ready, mole, while I draw the corks." It did not take long to prepare the brew and thrust the tin heater well into the red heart of the fire, and very soon every field mouse was sipping and coughing and choking, for a little mulled ale goes a long way, and wiping his eyes and laughing and forgetting that he had ever been cold in all his life. "They act plays too, these fellows," the mole explained to Rat. "Make them up all by themselves and act them afterwards. And very well they do it too. They gave us a capital one last year, about a field mouse who was captured at sea by a Barbary corsair and made to row in a galley, and when he escaped and got home, his lady love had gone into a convent. Here, you were in it, I remember. Get up and recite a bit." The field mouse addressed got up on his legs, giggled shyly, looked around the room, and remained absolutely tongue-tied. His comrades cheered him on, mole coaxed and encouraged him, and the rats that went so far as to take him by the shoulders and shake him, but nothing could overcome his stage fright. They were busily engaged on him, like watermen applying to the Royal Humane Society's regulations to a case of long submersion, when the latch clicked. The door opened, and the field mouse with the lantern reappeared, staggering under the weight of his basket. There was no more talk of play acting once the real and very solid contents of the basket had tumbled out onto the table. Under the generalship of Rat, everybody was set to doing something or fetching something. In a very few moments supper was ready, and Mole, as he took the head of the table in a sort of a dream, saw a lately barren board set thick with savoury comforts. He saw his little friends' faces brighten and beam as they all fell to without delay. He let himself loose, for he was famished indeed on the provender so magically provided, thinking what a happy homecoming this had turned out after all. As they ate, they talked of old times, and the field mice gave up the local gossip to date, and answered as well they could the 100 questions he had asked of them. The rat said little or nothing, only taking care that each guest had what they wanted and plenty of it. And the mole had no trouble or anxiety about anything. They clattered off at last, very grateful, and showering wishes of the season, their jacket pockets stuffed with remembrances for the small brothers and sisters at home. When the door had closed on the last of them and the chink of lanterns had died away, mole and rat kicked up the fire, drew their chairs in, brewed themselves a last nightcap of mulled ale, and discussed the events of the long day. At last the rat, with a tremendous yawn, said, "Old chap, I'm ready to drop. Sleepy simply is not the word. That your bunk over that side? Very well, I'll take this. What a ripping little house this is. Everything so handy." He clambered into his bunk and rolled himself up well in the blankets, and slumber gathered him forthwith, as a swathe of barley is folded in the arms of a reaping machine. The weary mole was so glad to turn in without delay, and soon had his head on his pillow in great joy and contentment. But ere he closed his eyes, he let them wander around his room, mellow in the glow of the firelight, that played and rested on familiar and friendly things which had long been unconsciously a part of him, and now smilingly had received him back without rancour. He was now in just the frame of mind that the tactful rat had quietly worked to bring about in him. He saw clearly how plain and simple, how narrow even it all was, but clearly, too, how much it all meant to him, and the special value of some such anchorage in one's existence. He did not at all want to abandon the new life and the splendid spaces to turn his back on sun and air and all they offered him and creep home and stay there. The upper world was all too strong. It called him still, even down here, and he knew he must return to the larger stage, but it was good to think that he had this to come back to, this place which was all his own, these things which were so glad to see him again, and could be always counted upon for the same simple welcome. There we go, another chapter done. Next chapter is chapter 6, Mr. Toad, and I will be back with that soon as I can to read that to you. Thanks for watching. Bye.